Hey guys, it's Horror Free for All, better known as Goosebumps Completionist, and I hope you're doing well today. So I have here a young adult slash kids horror book review from a franchise that I'm a massive fan of called Creepshow. Yes, if you didn't know, Creepshow a few years back had a duology of kids horror books. Now, I've already reviewed the first book called The Taker on my previous channel, which was also known as Horror Free for All before I merged that channel into this channel that used to be Goosebumps Completionist. I made a playlist of all the old Creepshow content I did up until I stopped doing it on my former channel. On this channel, so that way you can get caught up on all my Creepshow reviews up till this point. And here's the most recent one, and I guess the first official one on my newly christened channel here. And we're going to be looking at a book called Creepshow, The Cursed. Now, once upon a time, when the Creepshow television show first came out, there was a huge push in merchandise, and some may argue still to this day, Creepshow is still trying to experiment, still having stuff released on its behalf for the IP, whether it be the original 1982 movie or some newer stuff that still has yet to come out that's associated with Greg Nicotero's era of helming the Creepshow franchise. This year alone, we're wrapping up Volume 4 in the Image comic books, which is kind of a milestone, and I think they're actually ending Creepshow there, from what I gather. And they are leaning into a new spinoff called Super Creepshow, which is essentially the Creepshow format in the comics that everybody knows, but it's superhero-themed stories. And then we're getting a short story anthology collection, which is brand new for this franchise, which is featured with 13 authors helming brand new stories for the IP in short story Prouse format. So that's going to be fun and interesting. And who knows, maybe we'll finally get that video game down the pipeline and these new movies that have been speculated now to be coming out soon down the pipeline too. So maybe, just maybe, Creepshow is seeing a second renaissance. We'll see it when it happens, I guess. But this book right here, I guess, was the last thing I needed to review before all this newer stuff wraps up and comes out. So I wanted to get this out the way. I reviewed The Taker already, like I said. And I mentioned in that review, in case you want to go watch that, that I had no prior exposure to Ellie Cooper. And I didn't know what to expect going into these books, literally for two reasons. The first one being Scholastic, of all people, released these books with zero to no advertising, zero to no strong push. And to be honest, the second reason that I was apprehensive going into these is because I found them on the young adult shelf, but glancing at the stories, they seemed very kids horror related or adjacent, which made me think that I don't think that Scholastic knew how to market these fucking books. So, all said and done, though, after reading The Taker and The Curse now and experiencing all four stories that Ellie Cooper brought to this franchise, it was a valiant effort to do so, but I think the execution here kind of fell flat in a few areas, and I'll get into that, I guess, near my review portion of this book. If you don't know the layout of The Taker and The Curse, essentially, like the comics, there's two stories a book. However, here they took the approach of sandwiching essentially two kids' horror novels, which are usually around 100 to 120, maybe 130 pages. They sandwich two of those into one book. So in order to experience the full book, you got to essentially read the equivalent of two Goosebumps books worth of material. And to be honest, some of these ideas, if not all four of them, including the two that are in here, they feel stretched out. They didn't need to be that long. Honestly, if Cooper really wanted, she probably could have put all four stories in one collection and called it a day. But, you know, it's neither here or there because we got two books, and I guess we got to talk about this on its own merit. But I would say if you are a kids horror aficionado, maybe if you like some ideas that kind of feel like kids horror, but maybe elevated just a little bit, this is going to do it for you. If you're a big, massive fan of Creepshow like myself, I would not say that these are essential to the franchise, but they are kind of good, kind of a good time waster to see like a what if Creepshow tried a younger demographic. And to be honest, I do wish that the franchise takes another swing at it. Maybe they can come out with a competitive kids horror book series or something written by multiple authors. I think that would definitely spice up what we got going on in the kids horror landscape, at least as of now in the modern releases. So I welcome it, but they definitely need to go back to the drawing board on this format and maybe the person helming the books. And no offense to Ellie Cooper, but I'll explain my problems, like I said, later. So with that ramble aside, let's talk about the stories. So there's 2 stories featured in The Cursed. The first story is called The Green Mountain Monster, and the second story is called The Chatelain. So the opening story is The Green Mountain Monster, and this story is entirely set in the 1950s in rural West Virginia. And our main character, Randy, he is essentially a poor farmer boy. He has a small, tight-knit family. He has a little sister and 2 caring parents, but they literally have to pinch every penny that they earn as a family because times are tough around this date, I guess this time period in the state, and work isn't paying as much as it used to, and jobs are just harder to come across. So Randy tries to make the best of his situation. He goes to public school with a couple kids in town. He likes to frequent going every Saturday into town so he can watch his favorite movies or see his favorite stars in movies. And he particularly likes the horror variety. And we see that he's named a bunch of his farm animals that he takes care of to help out his family. The names of famous actors that star in these movies. And, one fateful day, he's looking for something to do. And he asks his friend, Bill, to come over. And Bill comes over. And they decide to go camping out in the woods because they don't have enough money to go see, movies in town. So when they go out into the woods to do this little camping trip, it's not too far away from where Bill and Randy live, since they're next door neighbors, but they do live out in the country. So they are kind of isolated from the rest of the community a bit. When the boys are out there and it's getting late after telling some campfire ghost stories to each other, they have this paranormal experience where they see this caped being that's pretty much all black with red glowing eyes and this green glow around its body sentience. And the boys are mystified in the moment, and once the being, I guess, evaporates, they both agree to kind of go back to bed quietly and discuss it the following day, because they don't want to rile each other up and kind of worry each other's parents if they have to go back home too early. And the next day rolls around, of course, and the boys are heading back to home, and Randy's trying to ask Bill his thoughts on what happened, and Bill's essentially like, look, dude, that probably didn't happen. That seemed like a hoax to me. It seemed like something fake that communists would rile up. Yes, there is some political I guess commentary in this story about communism, and it definitely plays a role, because in this story it's set in the 1950s. It's near the early days of the Cold War. The Red Scare is in full effect, and small town America is definitely keeping that in the forefront of their mind, that communist propaganda and hoaxes and all this paranormal stuff seems to be to them, in their minds, media plants to try to corrupt people into joining their cause. It's this whole thing in the story that Bill kind of goes on this mini tirade about, and Randy's like, look, dude, why do you go to that conclusion? Why can't you just say that it happened? And Bill just absolutely refuses it. And when Randy doesn't see Bill's side, they get into an argument. And when school starts up that following Monday, they refuse to talk to each other for like most of the day. And when Randy's trying to ask Bill why, Bill's like, well, I'm not saying that you are a communist or anything, but you believing in that stuff is putting me off a bit. And I don't want to talk to you until you get some sense. Yeah, so the whole experience has created a rift in their friendship. So Randy, because he can't really confide in Bill anymore because Bill's ignoring him, he tries to tell his family what happened. And his mom and dad aren't dismissive. They just they say that, oh yeah, you probably thought what happened to you did happen, but it most likely was a dream. So Randy's like, you know what? It could be that. And the little sister picks up on it too later on, as we'll see. But that would have been the end of it until Randy, he's awakened one night with a similar green glow going on in his backyard. And he's reaffirmed that it does exist. And he doubles down on that. So when he tries to go talk to Bill again, no avail, because Randy's like, look, I've seen it now twice. You know, you need to help me try to figure out what this thing is. And Bill's like, nah, I'm good. And this is after, mind you, this whole thing with Randy, he decides to go to the local library and find like monster encounter books to help coach him on what this creature could be in this small town. And after a certain point, the only person that believes him is his little sister. And then we see this new character, James, come into the mix. He's like a new kid from Cincinnati that a lot of people call weird because he's into the paranormal. And Randy decides to kind of befriend James because maybe James could help him with this ordeal. And the two of them decide to go venture out and find evidence of the creature together. And of course, they find evidence of the creature. And they come up with this harebrained scheme to take the story to the press and hopefully get the story exposure, because if Randy's peers and family won't believe him, maybe the media will get the story out there and get more eyes onto it. So maybe the public eye can see that Randy's actually telling the truth. So the story gets out, and of course, Randy and James are treated by the community, by like their teachers, fellow peers at their school, like they're a bunch of conspirators and they're making up fake stories. And Randy's mom gets embarrassed. His dad's, out of work because at some point of the story he injures his leg, fixing his back porch or something. And he's, I guess, hard on money. But there's a blessing in disguise with that story getting out, in that a couple of media outlets want to pay the family some pretty sizable amounts of money to be able to publish the story. So there's some confliction with the family over taking advantage of the money that's coming in from the story. And enough people eventually hear about it to the point where it becomes a huge thing. And it builds up to this climax where essentially the family gets to see firsthand, and Randy's whole goal this whole time was to convince his parents and his family that this actually happened. They get to finally see firsthand what exactly this creature possibly comes from, or creatures, I should say. And we see in the climax that they're here for a certain purpose. A certain individual and maybe some certain animals get taken by these quote-unquote creatures. And we get a epilogue set 30-something years in the future to kind of wrap up the events that transpired at that cliffhanger. And we get some resolution with the characters that are all involved in the story. And we get a twist ending that signifies that maybe it isn't all what it seems to be. I'm being very vague on that because I don't want to spoil the angle of the ending of the story, because it's one of these type of stories that rely on a punchline to kind of, kick in what the story was about. But yeah, that's essentially the first one here. So I'll get more into my thoughts near the back end of the video. So we're going to move on to the second story. And this one is called The Chatelain. Now, this one is set in the 2020s. We have a main character who's 15 years old named Maisie. And Maisie is what people, I guess, would call in these day and age a hipster. She's very into antique shopping, vintage clothing hunting, thrifting, stuff like that. She has amassed a huge wardrobe of vintage items that she wears to generate her own style because, in her opinion, modern people, specifically women, don't care about their looks as much as she cares about her looks. And she takes advantage of vintage clothing because they come from a time where clothing manufacturers and women put more emphasis in beauty, and she finds a lot of charm in that. And that does play, I guess, a heavy-handed moral near the back half of the story, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. But essentially, it boils down to Maisie. She loves to thrift every Saturday, and she has this favorite antique mall where she loves to go shopping. And it's very descriptive compared to the first story and how Maisie goes about doing her, Saturday routine here. But she goes to the antique mall one fateful Saturday and finds this vendor woman there that she's not familiar with, but the vendor woman has a bunch of really old and beautiful antique jewelry. And while Maisie is looking around the jewelry, she sees this beautiful brooch with, like, as you see on the cover, it has like, dangly things like a pair of scissors, some pin needles, and it just looks beautiful. And she thinks that it will look great on some old vintage Victorian clothes and some 1950s dresses and throwback dresses that look like Audrey Hepburn that she owns. So she inquires about what the brooch is, possibly the history of it. And this weird vendor woman basically says, like, I have this huge amass of macabre, I guess, going on here. Like, I got necklaces made out of hair. I got these weird bracelets that, go back to so-and-so. But this brooch is very old, and it's in beautiful condition. And I see that you really appreciate the style. And Maisie herself appreciates the woman's style too, because she's like wearing a corset. She's, wearing this old-timey clothes that she, I guess, is very mesmerized by. So the woman decides to give Maisie a good deal and tries to sell her the brooch for like $50. So Maisie agrees, and she can't wait to put it on and, accessorize her outfits with it. And almost immediately, she puts on her favorite black dress, and she puts the brooch on, and she goes to school. She gets a lot of compliments from these goth girls and these like edgy girls that think it's really cool. And then her best friend takes notice to it, and her best friend is like the opposite of her. I guess not that much into beauty and fashion, but even she acknowledges that it's really cool and it fits her personality. So Maisie's feeling on top of the world. And when she gets home, she decides to work on some homework after feeling, on cloud nine. But she falls asleep. And while asleep, it seems like she's transported to a different time. And she immediately thinks that she's like lucid dreaming because she feels like she's awake in the dream because she's literally a different person. She's dressed in like Victorian clothes. She's wearing a corset. She's around these people that she calls Papa. And there's a maid named Goovy, and there's a suitor coming after her that she's not aware of, but apparently he's taken a liking to her and wants to go dancing with her. So she gets a little bit of a taste of Victorian life and how she's treated, and then she's like zipped back into reality. And Maisie, unfortunately, decides that she misses this reality and wants to explore it more in the dream world, as she calls it. So she asks her friend, possibly some tips on like how it happened and maybe if she can help figure out how to revisit the dream where she left off. And part of the clue is that since she fell asleep with her black dress on with the brooch, the Chatelain, she puts two and two together and she's like, oh, it must be this brooch. So she puts it back on before she goes to sleep the following night. And of course, it transports her back to the Victorian age. And she's now living this life that she never knew. And then she meets some more people in the story. I think there's this woman named Victoria who happens to be the sister of this suitor that's coming after her, and she befriends her. And then slowly but surely, she realizes that it's not easy this second time going into the dream to get out of it. And she finds out rather quickly that she's being forced into an arranged marriage by this dream father of hers. And as the story unfolds, she reflects on her age, since she's only 15, and like how modern women have it better than Victorian age women, and that this is horrible. She's not really consenting to be married, and she's being pawned off because her father promises a huge dowry to the suitor. And there's this whole plot involving the suitor and some backstory that she uncovers about him that's very jarring and pretty scary, in that thriller-esque way. But there's also some existential horror in that she cannot find a way to use the Chatelain to escape the dream world that she's in and go back to where she came from, until saving grace comes near the end of the story, where she happens to stumble across this psychic medium after making a sham to basically escape her humble abode to go out shopping for this wedding. And she's given basic instructions on what she needs to do to go back to her time. And that may or may not play out for her. And we see some people in the story that deserve some comeuppance get their comeuppance, and possibly a happy ending for Maisie. And then we get this epilogue that's implying that the same vendor woman now has in possession a similar item that she's about to pawn off to potentially one of the girls from Maisie's high school that we saw earlier on in the story. So that in a nutshell is the Chatelain, all said and done. So now that I went over both stories, I guess we'll go ahead and talk about them here. So off the bat, I'm going to say this. Both stories do have that classic EC Atomic Age comic horror morality play to them. Specifically more so with the Chatelain. But I will say for the Green Mountain Monster, I was kind of shocked by the attempt at what the story was kind of talking about. And I touched on it in the Potter review, but you can definitely see the symbolism behind the Cold War scare and, being afraid of the Soviet Union and the communist takeover, kind of implanting itself into American culture. And setting the story in the 1950s in a rural area in the Appalachian Mountains where there's said to be cryptid creatures of legend and, kindred spirits and whatever have you that go back eons at this point. Millennia, back to the indigenous people even. It's an area that has a lot of superstition and lore, so it's easy to see the gravitas to tie that in politically to the supernatural here. And this was also around the time where, post Roswell, New Mexico in the 1940s, tabloid culture was hitting a peak and gaining huge momentum out there in the press, to the point where it kind of created its own subgenre of what people would call fake news, And I think that's what the story is trying to commentate on, is fake news. But, of course, you have to play on the trope of the boy who cried wolf. Is he crying wolf this time? Is it fake or is it actually real, And it comes to talk about, the typical morality play that usually comes out of stories like that is that seeing is believing, and what comes out of that. So, yeah. I was shocked that the story was able to pull that off. The main character, Randy, I'm going to say in comparison to Maisie in the following story, his journey here feels pretty stock standard to like a typical kids horror protagonist. He has falling out with his friends. His family doesn't believe him with this supernatural ordeal. He's essentially thrown into the situation alone. He has to find some unconventional help to get him out of this, or I want to say out of a bad situation, but help him through this hardship that he's going through, all the while trying to mend his friendship with his best friend Bill, who's become estranged because of these belief differences that they have about what they experienced together. it's very, you know, cut and dry, typical kids horror stuff, but he's written rather well. He's a likable kid with a good head on his shoulders. And I will say that in terms of like where the story goes in terms of horror, I think most people are probably going to enjoy the epilogue the most out of the whole, I guess, novel here, because this is like a 110-page story compared to the rest of the story, which, to be honest, I'm going to be upfront. You know, it's written pretty well, good characters, good setting and backdrop, some good atmosphere, cool concept for a monster. But the main problems with the story is that it's completely stretched out. It's a slog, slow burn type of story. It takes its sweet, methodical time to get to where you want the story to go. And sadly, when it ends up to that destination, there's just not enough going on. And coupled with that, once the action starts, the story cliffhangs and goes to the epilogue. And I wouldn't mind that if the epilogue had some satisfying answers and all of that. But the answers we get of what happened kind of feel left field, given the context of when the cliffhanger happened and I guess how it happened. And especially when it involves a certain character, and I don't want to mention it because it's going to pretty much give away what happens. But involving this said character, given what the epilogue provided contextually, I don't see how this twist makes logical sense. But if you don't think too hard on it, you can possibly, you know, say, "Oh, that's a cool twist." But when you stop to think about it just for 2 seconds, it doesn't make sense. So, for an intellectual like me that likes to think about stories in I guess a more deeper way than most, that is an issue for me. And yeah, coupled with the pace and just the story dragging ass the whole time. Honestly, this first one here, the Green Mountain Monster, I'm going to give about a 3 out of 5 stars, which I think is the same rating I gave The Taker from the first book of this duology, called, you know, funnily enough, The Taker. But I think this one's a bit of a step up there, except it has the inverse problems, where The Taker had a problem with bad characters and not liking these characters. This one, you had good characters, but the horror and the pace was kind of lacking there, where I think The Taker, even though it didn't have the best pace, I think the horror was a bit better. So it's a give and take there. Now, the second story, The Chatelain, I honestly was shocked that I actually liked this story, because just up front, I thought that Maisie, just on first impression, was going to be a character I would hate. But honestly, she had probably the best developed monologue out of all 4 stories in this duology. And in terms of writing ability, I think Ellie Cooper shined the best out of all 4 stories that she wrote for Creepshow in this story, with very descriptive prowess and atmosphere building, and even time period building. It was incredible when it comes to stuff like that. So technical abilities here were amazing. Maisie is a very likable character. What she goes through is the typical be careful what you wish for idea, in that she loves retro clothes. She loves glorifying the past and how women used to take pride in beauty and stuff. But the juxtapose that, she has to learn the moral that modern women had to overcome the crazy obstacles that the women of the past that she idolizes had to go through. And she doesn't realize how much she has it better off being in the present than glorifying the past. So there's a moral there about you know, respecting the sacrifices of your ancestors there, or the forecomers of who you represent, you know. So that was a pretty staunch message in the story that I took very privy to, and I clearly saw the moral lesson of the character when it came to that. So very good point of the story here. When it comes to how the story laid out the idea, the whole setup about buying a brooch at an antique shop, and the brooch ends up being a curse and not a blessing. you can see the angle coming a mile away, and that is the detracting point. It has that cursed item effect akin to something like the Haunted Mask or countless other stories where you use it once and you get a taste, and then you put it on a second time or use it a second time, and then you're hooked, but not hooked in the good way. You're hooked as in it has control over you, right? And you have no more say. Yeah, you can see where the story is going, but it weirdly captures a very good existential horror idea in that she's stuck in a time period that, while she thinks is really cool and she admires, she hates her social standing. She hates that she's a 15-year-old woman that nobody takes seriously, that she's under lock and key. She's basically told who she can marry. She has no free will in that. She's used for essentially family chess games for, society and all that. She sees like the real gravity of her situation, and it makes her sad, and it literally does tug at your heartstrings when you see her going through this stuff, when she realizes that she's being forced into a marriage, that she's never been on a date, she's never been able to find somebody that actually meets who she's looking for, and she doesn't want this for herself. But it makes you think, like, if she's going through that, did women of that time actually go through that problem? So on a deeper emotional level, the story is able to bring that out through this character. And the horror is definitely relatable when it comes to that. Even down to like the thriller aspect, dealing with like the suitor and the backstory involving him and all of that was very intriguing, and you had no idea where the story was going. And it had me glued right up until the climax, and even to the epilogue to a degree. But I think for me personally, when we got around to the climax, this is another one of these stories, kind of like all four actually, where Ellie Cooper loves to take her sweet ass time just stretching out these simple ideas. And while I was here for the ride for this one pretty well, when we got to the climax, essentially we knew what was going to need to happen before the climax started via the information that Maisie gets from the fortune teller woman. But the way it wraps up was so quick, and the description of the horror that could have come out of that wasn't the best given it all. And it just kind of felt like at that point of the story, I'm like, oh, like it wasn't terrible, but I was like, oh, really? You had to fizzle it out like that? You couldn't go a little bit overboard and made it a little more perilous in the moment? No, it just was pretty straightforward. Snap your finger, it's done. And I wasn't a fan of that, to be honest. Especially given that this story, again, is like 100-something pages. So I spent all my time reading this story just to have a climax wrap up in a page and a half. I'm not a fan of that, and I don't like it when other series do that. This is no different. And then the epilogue. I think the epilogue could have been, a place to save how rushed the climax was. Even though the resolution to the climax I did enjoy for Maisie's character, because she got, I guess, the best outcome she could have gotten in the situation she was in, and I was really satisfied about that. But where the story ends up, again, it's one of those things like, on the surface, you could be like, oh, that's a pretty, formulaic, but the twist works in this situation kind of thing. But like I said about Green Mountain Monster, this is one of those twists, if you put any thought into it for like two seconds, you're like, that doesn't really make much sense given what happened to a certain item in the story, how it ended up back in the possession of this person, or implied to be back in the possession of this person. I just don't see how that makes any sort of logical sense. And I don't think it's written in the best way to clarify what exactly it is. But other than those problems, I think the story was pretty exceptional. And mind you, like the first story here, I should have mentioned that before I rated Green Mountain Monster. I'm only rating these on 0.5 increments to kind of match it up with the rest of the Creepshow franchise, since it is mostly an adult horror series. So on this basis, for the Chatelain, I thought this one was good. It's one of the better stories that Cooper brought to this franchise. but it's not my favorite by any means. I probably give it like a 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is like a low good, but it's a recommendable good. If there's any story to check out from this specific book, it's the Chatelain. So, yeah. I might actually go ahead at some point soon and do a story ranking from these two books to hopefully get some more awareness about them out there and talk about them in, like, I guess, in the frame of mind of my least favorite to my favorite, and talk about why I have them there specifically. But until that point, that's all I really have to say about these Creepshow young adult / kids horror novels, because there was only 2, and this is my review of the second one. So yeah, if you haven't checked out my first review of The Taker, I'm going to have a link to that video in the comment section and in the description down below for you to go check out along with this review. So watch them both together. If these books pique your interest, please go check them out and go try to hunt them down at your local Books A Million, or go online and buy them for your collection. I want to say that they're the best things ever, but some of these stories might itch a scratch. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's artwork in both books that kick off both stories in each book that resembles comic book art. So if you like seeing, their Creepshow creep doing his thing, starting off stories, you're going to get that here with each story here. If you're morbidly curious about Creepshow and kids horror, or what that could look like, that's also another reason to check this out. Or maybe you just want something new to check out in the genre. There's another one for you. So yeah, until next time, let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.